Hi everyone, welcome back to our final lecture on the cardiovascular system. In today's lecture we will build on what we have been learning in the previous few lectures. Today we're going to start looking at blood pressure in much more depth. We're going to look at how your body maintains blood pressure and how it regulates blood pressure if we need to adjust it up or down. And we're going to quite often refer to that blood pressure chart that's at the end of your lecture outline. So make sure to have that handy. And we're going to be drawing out some flow charts today. So I encourage you to have some spare paper handy so that you can write those out along with me. So, as always, let's start with our not really attendance questions. First, what is or are the function or functions of ADH? What is the function of aldosterone? And what effect does the parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS, have on vasodiameter? Go ahead and pause the video and try to answer those. Hopefully you've done that, so let's take a look to see what the correct answers are. So first, ADH. Think all the way back to endocrine at the start of the semester. I told you that that would come back several times throughout the rest of the semester. So let's think, what are the functions of ADH? Well, first, ADH causes water to be reabsorbed at the kidneys. This makes sure that excess water is not leaving the body as urine, but instead it moves that water back into the bloodstream to keep you hydrated. And the side effect of that is it elevates blood volume, and that's going to be an important topic today. The other function has to do with, well, what's another name for ADH? Not what does it stand for. ADH stands for the antidiuretic hormone, but what's the other name for it? Vasopressin. And it's called that because in high enough quantities or in a high enough concentration, it acts as a vasoconstrictor. So it causes vasoconstriction. Next, what is the function of aldosterone? Aldosterone causes sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion, but we're more interested in the sodium reabsorption at the kidneys. And when that happens, water goes with it. So really, aldosterone and ADH, they're going to be released at the same time in the body. So aldosterone causes the sodium reabsorption, and ADH builds the channels, these things called aquaporins, so that water can follow that sodium. Now, lastly, what effect does the parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS, have on vasodiameter? Well, this is kind of a trick question because it has no effect on vasodiameter. It is one of the areas of the body where the SNS and the PNS do not both have an effect. Instead, vasodiameter is completely under the control of the SNS, the sympathetic nervous system, and PNS plays no role there at all. So vasodiameter is dictated by either elevated SNS activity or low SNS activity. All right, so let's look back at something that we saw at the very end of the previous lecture. When we were talking about what blood pressure actually is, we said blood pressure, which we said was the same thing as MAP, mean arterial pressure, but blood pressure is equal to cardiac output times peripheral resistance. And that is going to be what we focus on today. So remember, cardiac output, we said, could be adjusted by either altering stroke volume or heart rate. So stroke volume and heart rate are two things that will impact cardiac output. Cardiac output being the volume of blood ejected from a ventricle in 1 minute. Early in this unit, we talked about peripheral resistance, PR. Sometimes you might see it written as TPR, total peripheral resistance. But peripheral resistance, we said, kind of a quick and dirty definition, was how easy is it for blood to move through the vessels. In reality, peripheral resistance is the force or the resistance supplied by the blood vessels against the blood inside of them. Now, if we multiply cardiac output times peripheral resistance, we get blood pressure. But another way to think about that is we have two ways to maintain or regulate blood pressure. Those two ways being cardiac output and peripheral resistance. If either of these two go up or down, if they change, well, blood pressure will change. So let's start taking a look at all of the things that our body is capable of doing to maintain and regulate blood pressure. So here's the chart that I've referred to a few times now. This is what is on the last page of your chapter outline. And we're going to go through it real quick right now, but then we're going to come back to it a little further into this lecture. So across the top, we see blood pressure is equal to cardiac output times peripheral resistance. And we said that cardiac output is equal to stroke volume times heart rate. So we saw that by regulating stroke volume, we could regulate cardiac output. By regulating heart rate, we could regulate cardiac output. And now we've just learned if we regulate cardiac output or peripheral resistance, that will have an effect on blood pressure. Now, the way we read this chart is everything on this far left side, it's under stroke volume. In diastolic volume, contractility, and afterload. Well, at the end of most of the previous lecture, we saw that EDV, contractility, and afterload were the factors that affect stroke volume. So 1, 2, 3. Those are the three things that affect stroke volume. Heart rate, all of these things affect heart rate. SNS, PNS, epinephrine, thyroxine, calcium, fever, and cold. And we talked about those in the last lecture. Something that we started briefly discussing in the last lecture were ways that we could regulate EDV, venous return. Ventricular filling time was covered in lab. Now, contractility was another way to regulate stroke volume. And contractility could be regulated by sympathetic nervous system, epinephrine, thyroxine, glucagon, and calcium. All of these things, A, B, and C, regulate contractility, and contractility regulates stroke volume. These two things, venous return and ventricular filling, regulate EDV, and EDV regulates stroke volume. Today, part of what we're going to learn is the things underneath venous return, exercise, and blood volume will regulate venous return, which in turn regulates EDV. And we will see how do we regulate blood volume. Well, there's different things that impact blood volume. Hemorrhaging, ADH, ANP, the atrial natriuretic peptide, and aldosterone. Any of these four things will regulate blood volume. Blood volume regulates VR, VR regulates EDV, and EDV regulates stroke volume, which regulates cardiac output, ultimately regulating blood pressure. That's how this chart works. Over on the right, today we're going to see these things affect peripheral resistance, which affects blood pressure. So that's how this chart is going to work. Everything on here is under what it will impact. The one that trips students up the most is over here under stroke volume. The way this works is 1, 2, and 3 regulate stroke volume. A and B underneath EDV regulate EDV. Exercise and blood volume regulate VR. These things regulate blood volume. That's pretty straightforward. But if we get down here, let's just say thyroxine. Thyroxine is under contractility. We do not say that contractility is under any of these things right here. 2 means this is one of the things that regulate stroke volume. So thyroxine regulates contractility, which regulates stroke volume. I understand that can be a little bit confusing right now, but in a little bit we're going to apply these things and hopefully that will clear it up. So let's talk about maintaining blood pressure. We've already mentioned that stroke volume and heart rate regulate cardiac output. And we have talked about how EDV is one of the factors that impact stroke volume, which in turn regulates cardiac output. But let's now take a look at some things that regulate EDV. Well, venous return. We talked about this a little bit previously, but venous return, the amount of blood returning to the heart. So how much blood is coming back to the heart? If more blood comes back to the heart, then EDV will go up. If less blood comes back to the heart, then EDV will go down. And whatever EDV does, stroke volume is going to do the same thing. So let's just look at what happens. If there is an increase in venous return, then there will be an increase in EDV. And if there is an increase in EDV, there will be an increase in stroke volume. And if there's an increase in stroke volume, there's going to be an increase in cardiac output. And based on what we see here, if there's an increase in cardiac output, there will be an increase in blood pressure. So using this chart, what we just saw was exercise increases venous return, which increases EDV, which increases stroke volume, which increases cardiac output, which increases blood pressure. And so the way that that would look in a flow chart would be, and let me go back to this so that everyone can see where everything is, because what we're going to do is look at exercise and draw that out on a flow chart. So starting with exercise leads to an increase in venous return. So this is how that would be written. Exercise leads to an increase in venous return. And if we look at our chart here, venous return is right underneath EDV. And an increase in venous return leads to an increase in EDV, in diastolic volume. Now, not everything that's underneath something means that it will cause an increase. Some things will cause a decrease. For example, if we looked over here, cold is underneath heart rate. And remember, we said cold leads to a decrease in heart rate. So you do need to understand whether something increases or decreases whatever it's under. But EDV, it's under stroke volume, and we know the relationship is if there is an increase in EDV, there is an increase in stroke volume. And we learned previously that if there is an increase in stroke volume, there is going to be an increase in cardiac output. And what we've just learned is cardiac output and PR are the two things that impact blood pressure. And if there's an increase in cardiac output, blood pressure will go up. So exercise causes an increase in blood pressure. It does that following these means. Exercise increases venous return, which increases EDV, which increases stroke volume, which increases cardiac output, which increases blood pressure. So that's going to be how we use this chart and how those flow charts work. So another thing that can affect venous return is blood volume. Well, that, if you kind of think about what it's saying, is the volume of blood in your body, the amount of blood in your body impacts how much blood is coming back to your heart. Another way that I say that is If you have more blood in your body, more blood will come back to your heart. So if there is an increase in blood volume, that causes an increase in venous return. And as we just saw, increased venous return increases EDV, which increases stroke volume, which increases cardiac output, which increases blood pressure. So what kind of things cause an increase in blood volume? Because blood volume, the amount of blood in your body, seems like it would be relatively constant. But remember, ADH, what does it do? It increases water reabsorption. So increased ADH increases water reabsorption, which increases blood volume. ANP, so let's look at what happens if there's an increase in ANP. Well, if there's an increase in ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, remember we learned that it actually blocks water reabsorption. Technically what it does is it blocks sodium reabsorption. It blocks the effects of aldosterone. But if we lower sodium reabsorption, I'm going to go ahead and write that here. If we block sodium reabsorption, then water reabsorption is going to go down, lowering blood volume. And if we lower blood volume, then we lower venous return, lowering EDV, lowering stroke volume, lowering cardiac output, lowering blood pressure. Aldosterone would be the opposite of this. If there's an increase in aldosterone, there's an increase in sodium reabsorption, an increase in blood volume, an increase in venous return, an increase in EDV, increased stroke volume, increased cardiac output, increased blood pressure. And salt intake would look exactly like aldosterone. If you increase salt intake, your sodium levels in your body are up. And if your sodium levels in your body are up, the water levels in your body are up, which increases your blood volume, increasing venous return, increasing EDV, increasing stroke volume, increasing cardiac output, ultimately increasing blood pressure, which, by the way, that is why diets that are high in sodium, high in salt, cause blood pressure problems. Now, ventricular filling time. Whether or not you've had lab at this point, you may or may not have already talked about ventricular filling time. But as heart rate goes up, there is a decrease in ventricular filling time. Really what that means is in between one heart contraction, so one ventricular systole, and the next ventricular systole, that's when the ventricles are filling with blood. A topic from a couple of lectures ago when we covered cardiac cycle. So if the heart is beating faster, there's less time where the ventricles are in diastole filling with blood. There's less ventricular filling time the faster the heart is beating. Normally, this isn't too much of a problem, but once the heart rate passes 160 beats per minute, then the heart is beating so quickly that ventricular filling time is very decreased. And that causes a significant drop in stroke volume and cardiac output. Now, in athletes, it's really common to have low heart rate. I like to tell a story about a friend of mine that used to tutor at BCTC. He was a swimmer, and when he would go to the doctor, if it was a doctor that didn't know him, it could be very frightening because his resting heart rate was like 45 beats per minute. And 45 beats per minute for most people would be really, really slow. That's very tachycardic. So for his case, it actually was completely normal because in endurance athletes, people that are distance swimmers, distance runners, things like that, their heart is so strong that with each one beat, the stroke volume is so high that heart rate doesn't need to be very fast in order to achieve the same cardiac output. And when the heart gets really, really strong, very, very big and muscular, that's called ventricular hypertrophy or cardiac hypertrophy. So, maintaining blood pressure, factors that affect peripheral resistance. So we're changing gears now to the other side of the chart. We're looking at how easy is it for blood to move through those vessels. So what affects peripheral resistance? There's a few things. First is the blood viscosity. And one thing that affects blood viscosity is how many red blood cells are there? Remember the term hematocrit. The hematocrit can affect blood viscosity. And one thing that can significantly raise hematocrit is polycythemia. Polycythemia is a disorder that causes increased red blood cells, oftentimes from a tumor. But if you have more red blood cells and your hematocrit is elevated, well, your blood's going to be very, very thick, and thicker blood will have a harder time moving through the vessels. So increased blood viscosity causes increased peripheral resistance. Let me erase that. Increased blood viscosity causes increased peripheral resistance, which leads to increased blood pressure. Pen's not wanting to work very well here. Let's see what's happening. All right, so next, blood vessel length. The length of the blood vessel. Well, the longer a blood vessel is, the more it will squeeze on the blood within it. So this is one of the reasons why obesity causes blood pressure problems. With more tissue, another way to say that is with increased weight gain, with increased fatty tissue, blood vessels are longer in order to supply that tissue. So obesity leads to increased vessel length, and increased vessel length leads to increased peripheral resistance, increasing blood pressure. And next, vasodiameter. Well, obviously vasodiameter we've discussed with peripheral resistance way back in the very first lecture of this block. Vasodiameter, so either vasoconstriction or vasodilation, affects peripheral resistance. When we have vasoconstriction, vasodiameter decreases. And when vasodiameter decreases, peripheral resistance increases. So constriction causes decreased vasodiameter, which causes increased peripheral resistance, which causes increased blood pressure. Similar, vasodilation causes increased vasodiameter, which causes decreased peripheral resistance, which causes decreased blood pressure. So how do we cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation? Well, ADH. When we started this lecture, we said another name for ADH was vasopressin because it causes vasoconstriction. Ang2. Angiotensin 2 is the most potent vasoconstrictor in the body. So Ang2 causes significant vasoconstriction, which increases peripheral resistance, increasing blood pressure. ANP causes vasodilation, which decreases peripheral resistance, decreasing blood pressure. Inflammatory chemicals such as heparin. Remember, heparin was one of the things released from basophils. So heparin or other inflammatory chemicals, histamine, causes vasodilation, decreasing peripheral resistance, decreasing blood pressure. In some cases, a flood of histamine or heparin can cause a dramatic vasodilation, and that's what can cause someone to pass out sometimes if they have like a severe allergic reaction. If you have an increase or a decrease vasodiameter, if you have extreme vasodilation and peripheral resistance drops and blood pressure drops enough, now you can't get blood to your brain as well, and that causes people to pass out sometimes. And as we said initially, SNS controls vasodiameter and peripheral resistance. PNS plays no role. So if there is an increase in SNS, that causes a decrease in vasodiameter. And if there is a decrease in SNS, that causes an increase in vasodiameter. But PNS plays no role in vasodiameter at all. So here's everything that we just talked about. Everything on here. So Ang2, remember, it was a vasoconstrictor. So if Ang2 was up, peripheral resistance was up, which caused an increase in blood pressure. This chart can be used to fill out those flow charts. So let's do a couple of them in addition to what we've already seen. Let's say afterload. Afterload, when there is an increase in afterload. Why is that hard on the heart? Because when there's an increase in afterload, that causes a decrease in stroke volume. And if there's a decrease in stroke volume, that causes a decrease in cardiac output, which could cause a decrease in blood pressure. But if we want to maintain cardiac output and blood pressure, the heart has to work harder. So that's why an increase in afterload causes significant strain on the heart. Next, let's look at what happens with let's say cold. When there is cold temperature. Now this is not a cold. This is cold temperature. When there is cold temperature, that causes a decrease in heart rate. This is why when you pull someone out of a freezing body of water, sometimes their heart isn't beating very much at all. And that causes decrease in cardiac output, which causes decrease in blood pressure. Now let's look at a trickier one. Let's look at ADH. ADH, when there is an increase in ADH, if we look at our chart, the first thing that we do is we see that it causes an increase in blood volume. And blood volume is under venous return. So increased blood volume increases venous return, which increases EDV, which increases stroke volume, which increases cardiac output, which increases blood pressure. Now I said it was tricky because all this that we've just done, we've already seen. But ADH, if we look on our chart, we see ADH right here. But we also see ADH over here. Some of these things are in more than one spot. So what we would do is we would say everything that we have here, but we say also ADH separately from that causes vasoconstriction, which decreases peripheral resistance, increasing blood pressure. So ADH increases blood pressure two ways. It does it by influencing blood volume, and it does it by influencing peripheral resistance. I see an error that I've made here. ADH increases peripheral resistance by decreasing vasodiameter. Now, some of these things, like I said, they're going to be in more than one spot. Some of them may even have three spots. If we look at epinephrine, for example, epinephrine increases contractility, epinephrine increases heart rate, epinephrine causes vasoconstriction increasing PR. Now, let's look back here at ADH again. We're talking about ADH causing an increase in blood pressure. Two different ways, but it's increasing blood pressure both times. Why would we care if ADH increases blood pressure? Why would we want ADH to increase blood pressure? Well, think about what the stimulus for ADH is. The stimulus for ADH, let's write them across the top. One of them is increased plasma osmolarity. One of them is a decrease in blood volume. One of them is a decrease in blood pressure. All of these things indicate dehydration and a drop in blood pressure. So if there's a drop in blood pressure, ADH is released in order to bring blood pressure back up. This is not just trying to change blood pressure. This is trying to maintain and regulate blood pressure. When there is a drop in blood pressure, we want blood pressure to come back up. So lastly, let's look at calcium. An increase in calcium, well, we see it right here underneath contractility. Increased calcium causes increased contractility. And increased contractility is one of the ways that we can increase stroke volume. And when we increase stroke volume, we increase cardiac output, which increases blood pressure. But we see calcium here also. So calcium also increases heart rate, which increases cardiac output, which increases blood pressure. So calcium is one of those that has two separate rows. And we have to keep the rows separate because heart rate and contractility, they are two different mechanisms, two different pathways. So two separate rows here. So maintaining blood pressure, we've already done this. Let's talk about regulation of blood pressure. So we keep talking about blood pressure going up or down and what normal blood pressure is, 120/80, or even 120/75 in some sources, but that implies there is a set point. And there is, like just about everything in our body, there's a set point. And this picture, here it's back again. There's our teeter-totter, which indicates what? A homeostatic feedback loop. So if there is a normal blood pressure, then there has to be a way for our body to know what our blood pressure is. And there is a way. It uses something called baroreceptors. And baroreceptors are special nerve endings that detect stretch on, in this case, blood vessels. These blood vessels are just above the heart in a few different places. In the carotid sinuses and in the arch of the aorta. We see that over here. The carotid sinuses and the arch of the aorta. And the way these nerve endings work is they wrap around the walls of the carotid sinuses and the arch of the aorta. When there is a stretch on those walls of the blood pressure, then those nerve endings can tell that. When there is no stretch, those nerve endings can tell that. And they send action potentials to a part of the brain, the medulla oblongata. And the action potentials that these nerve endings send convey information about blood pressure. Let's think about how that happens. When your blood pressure is higher than normal, is this stretch on the walls of the blood vessels going to be up or down? Well, if your blood pressure is higher than normal, it's going to be pressing against those walls of those blood vessels. It's going to stretch them a little bit. And those nerve endings send signals to the medulla which interpret those action potentials as, hey, my blood pressure's up, I need to do something about it. Similarly, if your blood pressure is lower than normal, now there's not as much stretch on the walls of these vessels. They send action potentials to the medulla that interprets that as, uh-oh, my blood pressure's down, I need to do something to raise it back up. So that's how our body knows what our blood pressure is at any given moment. If it's going to be able to raise it if it gets too low or lower it if it gets too high, it needs to know what that blood pressure actually is. But let's think, before we look at how does our body fix that, let's take a look at how do these nerve endings convey that information to the brain. Because they're either going to send action potentials or they're not going to send action potentials. Remember from Bio 137, there is no stronger or weaker action potential. So there must be something hidden in the action potential itself that is sent to the medulla. And there kind of is. These nerve endings, the baroreceptors, are sending constant signals to the medulla. And the signals are sent one after another. I don't know if you'll be able to hear this, but I'm going to knock on my desk. Kind of like that. But if there is an increase in blood pressure, those signals are sent faster. And if there is a decrease in blood pressure, those signals are sent slower. And the medulla oblongata takes that information that's coming in, fast action potentials or slow action potentials, and says, our blood pressure is up, I need to bring it down. Or our blood pressure is down, I need to bring it up. And it does that a few different ways. If your blood pressure gets a little bit too high, there's a stretch on those baroreceptors. They send faster signals to the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata responds by slowing down or deactivating the sympathetic nervous system and activating the parasympathetic nervous system. So those cardiac centers are activated, and something called the vasomotor centers that affect vasodiameter are activated. If your blood pressure is up, then we're going to lower heart rate, and we're also going to lower contractility. Both of those things will lower cardiac output. We're going to cause vasodilation, which lowers peripheral resistance. The ultimate thing that happens is blood pressure drops back to normal. And it continues to drop until it gets a little bit too low, at which point now there's not as much stretch on those baroreceptors. And slower signals are sent to the medulla oblongata, which also activates the correct cardiac centers and vasomotor centers. We activate the sympathetic nervous system and deactivate the parasympathetic nervous system. Heart rate increases, contractility increases, both of those increase cardiac output. Vasoconstriction occurs, increasing peripheral resistance. All of that raises blood pressure back up to normal. And blood pressure continues to rise until it's a little bit too high, and then we go through it all again. So that is called the baroreceptor reflex, or the arterial baroflex. That is something that we will be practicing in lab this, either depending on when you watch this, last week or this week coming up, but this is something that we demonstrate in lab by intentionally triggering the baroreceptor reflex. Chemoreceptors can regulate blood pressure by altering the vasodiameter. This is much more of a topic that we will talk about in respiratory, not so much something to worry about in this chapter. Some other ways to regulate blood pressure. We have short-term hormonal controls. So The adrenal medulla, which is where our sympathetic nervous system is housed primarily. So the adrenal gland, right in the middle of it, we talked about in Bio 137, this is where epinephrine and norepinephrine come from when our SNS is activated. This causes an increase in heart rate, an increase in contractility, causes vasoconstriction. So all of that happens very, very quickly, but it does not last an extremely long time. Angiotensin 2, I said a little bit ago, was the most potent vasoconstrictor in the body. When it's circulating, it causes vasoconstriction, increasing peripheral resistance. ANP, the atrial natriuretic peptide, is a vasodilator, lowers peripheral resistance, and it lowers sodium reabsorption, lowering blood volume. ADH, which normally is a long-term because of how it affects blood volume, but when we're talking vasopressin, that part of it is much shorter lived. It's vasoconstrictive when we are hemorrhaging, when there's a sudden drop in blood volume. It becomes vasoconstrictive, but that part of it is short-term. Long-term renal. So renal is anything to do with the kidneys, and a long-term mechanism that the kidneys can do to regulate blood pressure is by filtering more or less liquid from our blood. If our blood pressure is too high, the kidneys can remove some water so that we can urinate it out. If our blood pressure is low, the kidneys filter less water, keeping our blood pressure elevated. And something called the renin-angiotensin mechanism. We're going to draw this out. It's going to take a full page, so go ahead and have something handy that you can write along with, draw along with, and this same thing will come back again later when we get to the kidneys. So let's look at something called the renin-angiotensin mechanism. Let me pull up a blank slide here. So we're going to look at what happens when there is a drop in blood pressure. When there is a drop in blood pressure detected by the kidneys respond by releasing something called renin. The kidneys release renin when there is a drop in blood pressure. So let's keep that kind of off to the side. Now, let's look at the blood. In the blood, remember back when we were talking about blood clotting, we said there's always some stuff circulating in the blood that a lot of the times is really doing not much of anything. Well, that's going to be the case here. Circulating in the blood, there's something called angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen. And this is something in the blood created by the liver that's most of the time not doing much of anything at all. But when there is a drop in blood pressure detected by the kidneys release renin. And renin takes angiotensinogen and converts it. Renin is an enzyme. And remember what enzymes do and what this little hook means? Renin takes angiotensinogen, it's going to convert it into something else, but renin is not changed. What does renin turn angiotensinogen into? Turns it into something called angiotensin 1, which is usually abbreviated ANG1. So let's say this again. When there is a drop in blood pressure, the kidneys release renin. Renin takes angiotensinogen that's in the blood and converts it to angiotensin 1, or ANG1. Ang1 is now circulating in the bloodstream until it gets to the lungs. And in the lungs, there is an enzyme called the angiotensin converting enzyme. And the angiotensin converting enzyme converts Ang1 into something called Ang2. Angiotensin converting enzyme converts Ang1 into Ang2. So now Ang2 is circulating in the bloodstream. And Ang2 does two separate things. It does one short term and one long term. So let's look at the short term first. Ang2, what did we call it? The most potent vasoconstrictor in the body. So it causes vasoconstriction, which decreases vasodiameter, which increases peripheral resistance, which increases blood pressure. And that's what we want if there had been a drop in blood pressure to begin with. That's our short-term fix. But we need a long-term fix. So Ang2 does something else. It travels to the adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal cortex. Remember the adrenal cortex from early in the semester in endocrine? At the adrenal cortex, what did Ang2 do? We said that it was a stimulus for something, so rack your brains and try to figure out what that was. Ang2 is one of the stimuli for aldosterone. Ang2, in addition to causing vasoconstriction, it tells the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. And what does aldosterone do? It increases sodium reabsorption. Aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption. All right, so now let's backtrack. This same drop in blood pressure that caused the kidneys to release renin also tells the posterior pituitary gland to increase the release of ADH. And ADH increases what? Aquaporins? So if we are increasing sodium reabsorption because of aldosterone, and we increase the number of aquaporins, what's that going to do? It's going to increase water reabsorption, which does what? Increases blood volume, which now you should be able to spout this part out. When there's an increase in blood volume, there's an increase in venous return, which increases EDV, which increases stroke volume, which increases cardiac output, which increases blood pressure long term. This is the renin-angiotensin mechanism. This is what's triggered when there's a drop in blood pressure. There is a very quick response because of Ang2 vasoconstrictor. There is a very long-term response because of altering blood volume. So let's talk some disorders. Well, hypertension. When we're talking blood pressure, we have to talk about high blood pressure. Hypertension. There are two primary varieties of hypertension. There's primary hypertension and secondary hypertension. Primary hypertension is about 90% of the cases of hypertension. And in primary hypertension, the cause is unknown. It doesn't mean that They can't figure it out. It just means maybe it's because of smoking, maybe it's because of diet, maybe it's because of something, but it's just they don't know it. They haven't been able to figure it out yet. Secondary hypertension only accounts for about 10% of the cases, and here they know what the cause is. Maybe it's smoking, maybe it's obesity, maybe it's something with the heart itself. But they already know what it is. So that's the difference. Primary, they don't know. Secondary, they do. Primary is 90% of the cases. Secondary is 10% of the cases. And on the flip side of that, hypotension. Here, this is one that a lot of students have not heard about until they get to this class. Hypotension means low blood pressure. So if you're hearing someone say hypertension, hypotension, they can sound the same. So I like to say hypertension or hypotension to really abbreviate or really exaggerate what it is that I'm saying there. And when you write these out, pay very special attention to how you're spelling it, because if you're meaning to say hypotension but you write hypertension, that will be wrong even though it's only 2 letters difference. Next, circulatory shock. And circulatory shock, there's a few different types of it. So in circulatory shock, really what it means is we cannot circulate our blood normally, but the reason could be different. In hypovolemic shock, this means we do not have enough blood. So something like a hemorrhage is taking place. If you don't have enough blood, well, now we can't circulate that blood. Vascular shock. This is something to do with the blood vessels. This happens with extreme vasodilation and drop in peripheral resistance. If your blood pressure is really, really low because of vasodilation, then we can't circulate the blood normally. In cardiogenic shock, well, the blood volume is normal and the blood vessels are normal, but the heart itself is causing the problem. The heart is not contracting enough to circulate the blood. All right, so that is the end of this block. That brings us to the end of cardiovascular. Next up, we're going to be having our 3rd lecture exam, where we are going to cover all of block 3, but as always, remember there's a little bit of block 1 and a little bit of block 2 there also, especially the things that really tie in to cardiovascular. So just make sure you're going back and reviewing that old material as well. All right, take care, ask questions as you need to, do well on the exam, and I will see you in block 4.